Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to take a stack of, well, pretty intense research and really pull out the essential insights, the goal, to make you the most well-informed person in the room. And today, we're using what might be the ultimate vehicle for intellectual exploration, science fiction.
Oh, absolutely. It's the perfect engine for this kind of thing. Science fiction, SF, it's often just seen as like genre entertainment, maybe stuck on the back shelves. But when you really dig into the academic sources, it's so clear that SF is this incredible genre for, well, serious philosophical and sociological thinking.
Yeah, exactly. By taking these really fundamental questions about culture, power, identity, and putting them onto, say, alien worlds or future timelines, authors can get this clarity, a clarity that's often, impossible when you're writing directly about our world right now.
Right. It lets us look at the deepest foundations of human society without all the immediate baggage of current politics and arguments.
Our source stack today really backs this up. We're pulling from some heavy hitters university research covering translation theory, communication, anthropology, and deep dives into post-colonial studies. Plus, we're looking at this massive global phenomenon, Chinese science fiction.
And our mission, really, for you listening, is to shortcut that path, to help you understand how SF works as this vital tool for critical thinking, for cultural discussion today.
We're not just talking about cool spaceships and gadgets, those are fun. We're talking about challenging our core assumptions about human difference, conflict, and maybe most importantly, how power actually works and lasts.
Precisely. And I think we need to start by grounding this whole idea. SF isn't just fun, it's a serious academic tool. It's used to challenge how we think about difference.
Okay, let's unpack that. There's a great example from the sources, actually, showing how this works in academia itself. Professor Phil Schurter's course, Anthropology and Aliens, he uses speculative fiction specifically to teach cultural relativism, which is, let's face it, a tricky concept.
It's brilliant, really, because it kind of bypasses our built-in biases.
Yeah.
Seychelles argues, that by presenting these alien species or totally different future societies, SF helps students get that norms and practices aren't universal. They're shaped by context.
Right.
Like if you tell a student, oh, this culture in Southeast Asia does this radical thing, their own cultural filters immediately jump in. But if you say, the people on Planet X do this totally bizarre thing, well, they've got no existing framework. It forces genuine curiosity.
That's the key, isn't it? You're forced to look at the other without the weight of human history or like current political fights. The big insight here from anthropology is that when authors create aliens, they're often, maybe unconsciously, channeling real-world stuff, colonialism, racism, gender issues.
Yeah, it reveals how deeply embedded our own human ideas about other cultures really are. It's like the meta lesson is when you look at an alien in SF, you're often looking into this distorted mirror, a mirror reflecting humanity's own fears and, well, prejudices.
And the sources bring up Blade Runner as a perfect example here. The replicants. They aren't really aliens from space, are they? They're bioengineered, look human, made by this huge corporation.
They were the constructed other.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that immediately sparks the big anthropological question. What does it actually mean to be human? The replicants, even though they're made, not born, you feel for them, right? Because they're just trying to survive
Right.
in a system that sees them as disposable tools. That line between human and other gets deliberately fuzzy.
Which forces the audience, us, to confront our own ideas about identity, about personhood, in a way that, I don't know, maybe a straightforward documentary on labor rights just wouldn't achieve in the same way.
Precisely. It hits differently.
Okay, I love that shift. So if anthropology uses SF to understand difference, let's pivot a bit to philosophy. How do these differences communicate? Because the sources point out this huge divide between two giants of philosophical SF, Ursula K. Le Guin and Stanisław Lem.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Both of them are deeply concerned with cultural contact, right? But they end up in completely opposite places about whether genuine communication is even possible. They frame that whole dynamic native culture versus, like, the outsider, the cosmopolite, in fundamentally different ways.
Okay, let's start with Le Guin. Her work seems to suggest communication is possible, right? Though maybe really, really hard.
Exactly. Her vision, especially in The Left Hand of Darkness from '69, it's optimistic, but incredibly complex. You follow AI Gentry. He's an ambassador sent to this planet Gethin. The people there are androgynous. His job is to convince them to join the Acumen, this sort of free federation of planets.
Right.
And Le Guin's whole point, essentially, is that differences, if you genuinely accept them, if you really face them head on, they can become the very foundation for understanding. This is what the research calls the transcultural mode.
Okay, explain that mode a bit more.
It's about achieving this deep understanding that comes directly from recognizing and accepting difference, accepting otherness. That acceptance then becomes this bridge leading to synthesis, to real change in how you see the world, your subjectivity.
Wait, hold on. It's not about ignoring difference. It's about accepting it. That sounds, well, incredibly optimistic, especially when you look at, real-world communication failures where difference is often the weapon.
It is optimistic, but Le Guin makes it clear it's also incredibly demanding. The key is Ea Gentry's own internal shift. He really struggles to understand the Athenians because their androgyny just completely messes with his Earth-based binary ideas of gender and identity. He initially rejects his travel partner, Esterven, partly because Esterven's very being makes him deeply uncomfortable.
Okay. And the power of this transcultural mode, then, is when AI finally gets it, when he accepts Esterven.
Yes. That moment when he realizes and accepts what he'd been suppressing, that Esterven was a woman as well as a man, existing completely outside AI's rigid mental boxes.
And that required him giving up his fear, his assumptions.
Absolutely. He had to sacrifice his fear, his ingrained cultural programming. And it leads to a synthesis. His identity is permanently changed by this encounter. He understands more, but he still remains who he is, a male earthling. The crucial part is the otherness didn't need to be erased or assimilated. It just needed to be truly seen and accepted for what it was.
Okay. Now, contrast that hard-won optimism with Stanisław Lem, specifically Solaris from 1961. Chris Kelvin goes to try and communicate with, well, a sentient ocean covering a whole planet.
Lem gives us a much, much darker vision. It's almost a direct counter-argument to Le Guin, really. In Solaris, communication is, at the end of the day, impossible. He posits this absolute otherness.
Impossible? Why?
The failure isn't because of hostility or misunderstanding intentions. It's because there's this unbridgeable gap between intelligences. The ocean entity is just fundamentally incomprehensible. It's too alien for human minds, human tools, human language to even grasp.
Wow. So Le Guin shows differences, when accepted, can create a path to synthesis, a new understanding. Lem shows some differences are just absolute walls, the limits of human comprehension leading to total communication breakdown.
Exactly. And researchers kind of use these two big foundational extremes, Le Guin's possibility and Lem's impossibility, to map out how these transcultural encounters affect identity. They boil it down to three distinct modes, which is actually a really useful way to think about cultural interactions, not just in the SF, but like everywhere.
Okay, let's slow down then and really lay out these three modes. How does each one handle difference?
Okay, so first up, you've got the classical or multicultural mode. In this one, the basic identities of everyone involved, the self and the other, they're basically reinforced, kept intact. The encounter might involve, polite tolerance of difference, but there's no deep change in how anyone sees the world, no real subjective shift.
So like agreeing to disagree and keeping a safe, respectful distance, live and let live sort of thing.
Pretty much. The sources mention Doris Lessing's work as examples here, where encounters tend to reinforce cultural differences rather than bridge them. The boundaries stay totally solid, even if there's no open conflict. It's accommodation? Maybe, but definitely not synthesis.
Got it. Okay, contrast that with the second mode, the postmodernist mode. What happens when that comfortable distance just disappears?
Right. The postmodernist mode kicks in when there are these underlying similarities, maybe cultural, maybe even physical, that actually erase the clear lines of difference. When you literally can't tell the difference between yourself and the other, those cultural boundaries blur. They often get destroyed entirely. And that forces everyone to consciously try and build new ways to define themselves.
Okay. This sounds like the Cylon problem in the rebooted Battlestar Galactica, right?
Exactly. Perfect example. The Cylons, some of them, are physically indistinguishable from humans. They are like Haraway's cyborgs, these hybrid beings, human and machine. And their ontological indeterminacy, the fact you can't reliably pin down what they are, it totally challenges the essentialist ideas of identity that both the humans and the Cylons themselves rely on.
It's like the ultimate nightmare of assimilation, because if you can't even tell who's who, how do you maintain a distinct cultural identity? Your borders just dissolve if the other looks exactly like you.
Which loops us right back around to Le Guin's transcultural mode. This is argued in the research to be the most, let's say, productive outcome. Because here understanding is achieved through accepted difference, not just tolerated difference like the classical mode or erased difference like the postmodernist one.
Okay.
Acceptance leads to that synthesis, that profound change in outlook, but, and this is key, it still allows for individual cultural identity to be maintained. The difference itself becomes the asset, the common ground you use to build communication.
That leap from difference to understanding makes the connection to power dynamics feel essential. If SF is this amazing lab for working through difference, it must also be a critical lens for post-colonial theory, right? For looking at how power structures are built and how they last generation after generation.
Oh, absolutely. There's a deep structural similarity there. Both post-colonial theory and SF, they're often broad, sometimes messy genres, but they share this core goal. They want to disrupt how readers see reality, offer social commentary, often by dealing heavily with history and its consequences.
The sources specifically mention SF's nostalgic drive, this kind of obsession with revisiting or reimagining the past. Post-colonial criticism looks at how past events affect the present, right? While SF takes that past and maybe plays it out to an extreme or theorizes how history might repeat itself in the future or on other worlds.
Yeah, it gives post-colonial critique this speculative playground, a place to illustrate power dynamics, hegemony, without being strictly tied to Earth-specific history. But, and this is important, we have to acknowledge the history of the genre itself. Despite all this potential for critique, historically, a lot of SF was, well, firmly on the side of power structures, as one source puts it.
I never really thought about that. Why was that the default for so long?
Well, think about who was writing and reading classic science fiction, especially in the mid-20th century. It was largely a demographic that perhaps implicitly enjoyed stories where, macho heroes enforced their will over foreign and futuristic landscapes. Space exploration narratives often mirrored, sometimes uncomfortably closely, the colonial projects of earlier centuries.
So even something like Star Trek, the original series, which we often think of as progressive for its time, could actually be seen as part of this historical bias.
Well, yes, in some ways. The source material points out Captain Kirk is essentially this swaggering spaghetti western type hero. He beams down, encounters a less advanced or morally different culture, and basically imposes his usually American Enlightenment-influenced moral framework. It can look a lot like colonialism with a starship. It's really only when authors from previously marginalized perspectives started writing SF that the critique became truly sharp and self-aware.
Right. That history makes the rise of critical SF, the kind that directly tackles post-colonial ideas, even more important. And one of the concepts SF seems uniquely suited to explore is this idea of colonial amnesia.
Yes, colonial amnesia. It's this phenomenon where imperialist cultures or the descendants of colonizers develop this inability to really reconcile with the atrocities of their past. And this inability often turns into a deliberate, sometimes unconscious, erasure of that past from the collective memory. It's a key way hegemony is maintained.
It's structural power in action. The colonizer group isn't challenged, isn't forced to deal with what happened, which allows the unequal structures built on that past to just stay in place, often justified by a comfortable, sanitized version of history.
And that actually leads us nicely into discussing a really significant modern movement, the rise of Chinese science fiction, or Kextuangsang. It's emerging as this global cultural force, offering a distinctly non-Western narrative and critique.
Yeah, this is huge, isn't it? We should look at Chinese SF not just as, literature from China, but as this potentially massive transnational cultural tool. It's expressing a Chinese perspective globally, maybe in a bottom-up way, kind of like how Japanese manga or Korean K-pop became global forces.
Exactly. Think of it like that. The big initial breakthrough was really about the finance escape the money and global recognition. That kicked off when Ken Liu translated Liu Cixin's The Three-Body Problem into English back in 2014. That translation was the tipping point.
Right. It suddenly put Chinese SF on the map for Anglophone readers.
It totally did. And it paved the way for other authors, like Hao Jingfang, to get international attention, too.
And then came the Hugo Awards, which is like the Oscars for science fiction. Liu Cixin won Best Novel in 2015. Hao Jingfang won Best Novelette in 2016. That sent a clear signal, didn't it? A non-Western SF tradition wasn't just showing up. It was defining the conversation.
Absolutely. And then you had the idioscape kick and the influence of powerful people. Former President Obama famously listed The Three-Body Problem as significant reading during his presidency. He talked about its immense scope, making his daily problem seem petty. Mark Zuckerberg was another major proponent.
Those kinds of endorsements are massive, right? They act as this huge cultural stamp of approval, pushing the genre from a niche interest into the global mainstream consciousness. But what's really interesting to me is how Liu Cixin manages this global reach while also keeping his work so deeply rooted in Chinese experience.
That's a crucial point. He explicitly draws very heavily on modern Chinese history. And that creates this sense of we-ness, as the research calls it, among Chinese readers, something distinct from the usual Anglo-American SF tropes.
Like the opening of the three-body problem set during the Cultural Revolution.
Exactly. It's visceral, it's specific. Lucy Geekson himself talked about this, calling the Cultural Revolution an extremely turbulent time, so dark and absurd that even classic dystopias like 1984 felt, to him, lacking in imagination by comparison. That specific historical context becomes this powerful regional marker within the universal language of SF. So by grounding the story in these specific, often traumatic national experiences, Chinese SF asserts its own unique voice and critical perspective on the world stage. While, Western SF might keep referencing the Cold War or frontier myths, Chinese SF is grappling with its own unique history. Rapid modernization, collective trauma, massive societal shifts.
Okay, that gives us a fantastic theoretical toolkit. Now let's really dig into the detailed speculative scenario that's embedded in our source material. It's like a fictional case study that uses all these concepts we've talked about, colonial amnesia, hybrid identity, transculturalism, to show exactly how they might play out.
Right, this is where it gets really fascinating, because this narrative gives us a complete working model of how colonial hegemony gets built, how it's maintained, and how it's eventually confronted. The architect of this whole society is a figure named Helena Marvich, known only as the Magistrate.
And her motivation sounds almost noble on the surface.
Deceptively simple, yeah.
Yeah.
The survival of the human race.
Yeah.
At absolutely any cost. She's the one who led the last fragments of humanity from a destroyed Earth to this new planet, creatively named New Earth.
But securing this new home involved, well, an atrocity. Something that perfectly embodies colonial violence and the absolute necessity for the colonizer of creating that structural amnesia afterwards.
It was brutal and insidious. She admitted eventually to ordering a nuclear strike just 5 years before the main human city, the capital, was founded. But the deeper, more horrifying act was deploying this custom-engineered genetic plague, a virus.
And this virus wasn't just designed to kill the native inhabitants of New Earth.
No, that's the terrifying part. It was designed to erase them, to rewrite their very biology and make them human. It was her fail-safe, converting the genome of every infected native to human DNA.
Literally overwriting their existence.
Yeah. The journals describe the infected natives becoming shells of their former selves, suffering these agonizing physical transformations, shriveling, withered under the weight of new bones and new needs. They had to adapt biologically or just die.
And the conversion wasn't even perfect, was it? It left these small but permanent physical markers. The converted race, who became known as the Northerners, they looked almost human, but not quite.
Right. They had altered blood, this pale orange-white color. Their skin was unnaturally pale, reacted badly to the sun. And there were structural changes, like going from 6 limbs and 7 digits, apparently, down to the human standard of 4 limbs and 5 digits.
These physical differences became the lasting, visible trauma of the colonization, didn't they? A literal mark of otherness that the magistrate then had to obscure.
Exactly. And this is where the colonial amnesia machine kicks into high gear. Helena deliberately manufactured the entire history for the citizens living in the capital. She spun this tale about humans destroying their own original homeworld to justify her absolute rule on New Earth and completely erase the 2 centuries of murder and forced conversion of the native population.
Right.
The citizens believed they had arrived on an empty planet, a fresh start.
And she saw this massive lie not as evil, but as necessary.
As a kindness, even. She argued it would be needless cruelty to shatter their delusions. She was apparently quite content in her old age, believing she'd successfully ensured humanity will not fall, no matter the cost. Her core belief, chillingly simple, all civilizations are built on blood.
Okay, so who challenges this? This brings us to the burden of inherited identity, right? Represented by the 2 main characters, Maria and Jacob, who have to unravel this centuries-old lie.
Right. Maria represents one side of that inheritance. She's the granddaughter of a crew member who was there at the beginning but failed to stop Helena. He was a bystander, essentially supporting the colonial power through inaction.
So Maria inherits the moral weight, the responsibility to fix it.
Exactly. Her quest is driven by finding her grandfather's hidden journals. And these journals reveal the devastating truth about the timeline they weren't in, year 2500 of human history, as everyone believed. They were only in New Earth, year 200. 2,000 years of history, fabricated. Their whole identity was built on this lie.
And Jacob's story, his confrontation with this colonial amnesia is much more direct, more physical, isn't it?
Oh, completely. He was raised entirely within the capital, believing himself fully human, fully part of the colonizer group. Then he meets Silas Keyes, this rebel figure from the converted race, the Northerners, who's been branded 6 times for life sentences.
And Silas forces the truth on him.
In the most visceral way possible. Silas asks Jacob about the color of his blood, then he cuts his own arm, showing that pale orange-white liquid, the mark of the converted. And Jacob realizes in that instant that his blood is the same. His entire racial identity was a lie, chemically forced upon his ancestors by the magistrate's virus.
Wow, Silas tells him, "We're not human, Jacob." Not entirely, anyway. That must just shatter everything.
His entire world collapses. He is the hybrid, the forcibly converted, the living evidence of the atrocity Helena tried to erase. And meanwhile, the descendants of the original natives, now calling themselves the family in resistance, they've actually embraced the capital's dismissive term for them, Northerners. They've turned it into an identity marker of difference, of resistance, dedicated to taking down Helena's lie. They accept their otherness as strength.
So, the climax, Maria eventually confronts Helena, the magistrate.
Yes, but Helena is completely unrepentant. She's old, she's content, she's proud of what she built, convinced that the hegemony of the power structure is now built into the foundations of the society itself. She says her own death wouldn't really change anything because the system would endure.
Okay, so who delivers the final blow? It feels like it should be Maria carrying the weight of her grandfather's inaction.
You'd think so, right? Maria's there, she has the knowledge, she understands the historical crime. She represents that intellectual reckoning, maybe the Le Guin-style acceptance of the dark past. But she hesitates.
It's Jacob.
It's Jacob. The one who physically embodies the colonized identity, the hybrid reality, the one whose blood carries the literal mark of the conversion. He's the one who pulls the trigger and kills the magistrate.
And that choice feels significant.
It's crucial. The source material really emphasizes this. The agency to finally destroy the architect of the colonial project rests with the body, the group, most directly violated by it. Not the descendant of the perpetrator, however well-intentioned. It shows where the real power shift, the real possibility for change has to come from.
Okay, so pulling all this together, the philosophy of contact, the post-colonial critique, this incredibly detailed fictional example, what does it all tell us?
Well, I think it shows how incredibly effective science fiction is at illustrating the sheer moral complexity of these situations. It demonstrates that agency, responsibility, they aren't simple. They cross generations. They cross racial lines, like with Maria, Jacob, and the Northerners, all playing different necessary roles.
Right. Maria needed to do the work of understanding, accepting her family's complicity, that Le Guin-style acceptance of the difficult truth. But the actual action, the breaking point, required the lived, physical reality embodied by Jacob and the Northerners.
And SF just pushes us past easy answers, doesn't it? You see the stark contrast between Le Guin's hope for synthesis through difference and Lem's warning about absolute otherness making communication impossible. And in the magistrate story, you see how power structures can endure even after the tyrant who built them is gone.
Destroying Helena Marvich didn't automatically dismantle the society she created over 200 years.
Exactly. So the final takeaway, maybe, for you listening, is that SF is this persistently challenging genre precisely because it forces us to interrogate not just the initial moment of colonization or contact, but the long, often traumatic afterlife, the legacy.
The question of the foundations. Like, the source material leaves us hanging a bit, doesn't it? Even after the person who ordered the atrocities and built the lies is gone, can those deep foundations of a cultural hegemony literally built on lies, on blood, on forced genetic change, like that virus, can they ever really be erased?
Or does killing the magistrate just open the door to a new, maybe even more complex struggle? A struggle for the Northerners, for the hybrid generation like Jacob, for even the descendants of the original colonizers like Maria, to figure out how to build some kind of future together when their shared history, literally running through their veins, is so fundamentally traumatic. That's the unsettling, powerful question SF often leaves us wrestling with.